Tonight, we'll be learning about immigration and community memory. And as part of those themes, it's important to recognize that here at Mohi, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place with lasting impact on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's critical that we hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. And we encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. Tonight's speaker is Thanh Tân, an award-winning multimedia storyteller based in Seattle. Her work has been published in local and national media, including KUOW, KCTS, This American Life, and the New York Times. Creator of the Second Wave podcast, Thanh has also produced documentaries, founded Viet Fact Check, and archived South Vietnamese ephemera. Please give her a warm welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much to everyone who's in our audience and also to anyone who's watching. I'm going to try to be mindful that it's not as easy to watch this presentation when you are online, so I will try to speak slowly, which is not my strong suit. I talk fast. So audience, help me out. If I'm talking too fast, just, hey, like slow down, calm. Like many of you, I'm really nervous and scared, and there's a lot going on right now. So I hope tonight is interactive. If anyone online does have questions, please put them in the comments if possible, and then if our staff and team maybe raise your hand or signal to me, I want to make sure that we get to any questions that people out there may have. And for all of you who are here, we do have a microphone, and I want this to be interactive because what I'm going to show you today is not a result. It's actually the beginning of a journey to try to contextualize and to humanize a lot of the people that you're going to see. And so if you see yourself or you see someone you know, raise your hand, and I'll try to pay attention. Because I've been shocked in just the last couple days of trying to identify and thinking, I think I recognize this person, and it turns out it's my friend's father, that kind of thing. So, and I think the first slide here, I put a picture of a bag, and I hope you all can take a moment to reflect. Even though I'm focusing on the Vietnamese experience, I think there are universal themes that can apply to anyone. And I put this picture here because it's a photo of the bag that held my parents, all of their belongings in the world that they had when they escaped from Vietnam in 1978. They were in a refugee camp in Malaysia for 6 months, and they resettled. They were helped and sponsored by people here in Washington State. And so my mother showed me this about 10 years ago, and their boat had capsized, so they lost everything. And they had some, they had a few things they were able to save, and they amassed some things in the camps. But I hope you all think about, if you were forced to flee, if you had to leave, what would you take with you? If this was all you had, and sometimes you have nothing, no material things, all you have are your memories. And when I saw this bag, my parents kept the tag, and they keep everything, and the tag has my dad's name, and just knowing that you flew Malaysian Airlines to come here to the United States. And my mother says that this looks like a bag, but it was actually a little girl's tank top. And in the camps at that time, refugees would leave in waves. So once someone sponsored you and you were leaving, you would leave behind objects and things that other refugees could still keep. So my mom says this was a little girl's tank top, and she sewed it up in order to carry the paperwork that they were able to take with them. And so just think about that. What would you take with you if you were forced to flee? Before I start tonight, I have some so-called caveats that I want to share with you all. I want to acknowledge that the Vietnam War's impact extends way beyond Vietnam. And the Vietnam War also shaped the histories of all of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines. And I want this presentation and any storytelling that I do to acknowledge that complexity, that even though we call it the Vietnam War, it just stretched so much further than Vietnam. Also, I am not a refugee or an immigrant, and I am an American-born person of Vietnamese heritage, and I benefited from birthright citizenship, and I am the first American born in my family. And I don't think I ever thought about that. You don't think about it until all of a sudden it's at risk of being taken away. And it's weird to think about this benefit that perhaps I just totally took it for granted and didn't think about it. And also, I'm not here today to debate the rights and wrongs of communism or to talk about rescue or to talk about just gratitude as a daughter of refugees. I'm here as a citizen archivist, and my focus and my practice is really on trying to rehumanize people who have been oftentimes reduced to stereotypes. In doing this work also, it's about confronting some hard truths and embracing nuance. And I really believe strongly that we, as refugees and immigrants, we're allowed to be fully human. And I think I grew up very much believing I have to be perfect and I have to earn my spot in America because my parents dropped everything and lost everything. And I felt that pressure. And I don't want to feel that pressure. It's like I get to make mistakes and, I don't have to be perfect. I struggle with this. I go to therapy every single week to try to deal with this. But, the idea is if we look at these things and we talk about it, maybe we can let go of that need for perfection and allow all of us to live with our, full complexity. The images and the stories that I'm sharing today primarily come from my personal archive, but I also found myself drawn to collecting things that I'm presenting today from a trip to the Washington State Archive in 2015 with former Secretary of State Ralph Monroe. Wonderful, generous public servant, and when he found out I was working at the Seattle Times back then, and he said, "You come down to Olympia and I will come with you and guide you through the archive, and we'll look at my papers, we'll look at Dan's papers." And we did that, and from that, I made a whole lot more, but these are the photocopies because I was so intrigued because I felt like it was opening up this portal to the past that I had no idea about. And I felt a lot of things, and I'm still trying to process that. And so this is a starting point to me, and I feel that there's a lot more to explore. Also, my presentation today is going to go beyond Seattle, and it's going to focus on Washington State as a whole. There's also going to be references to other states and how they responded to Vietnamese refugees, and also to policy that was coming out of Washington, D.C., which certainly had an impact because federal support and federal funding and support from the top down, from the White House, was absolutely essential to Washington State's response after the end of the Vietnam War. And the overarching goal here, again, is to create space for some reflection and learning. I do not have the full context for every story, and I think that now is the time, 50 years after the end of the Vietnam War, now is the time to fill in those blanks. And so I invite you to please help me and help me out because I see value in building a community archive. And so if you do have knowledge to share, if you have photos you'd like to find a space for, raise your hand, come talk to me afterward. I'll leave my contact information. I think it's important to also ground ourselves in what was Washington State's connections to the Vietnam War. For many of you, I'm sorry, because you lived through it, so I shouldn't really be telling you this, but I'll just very broadly. Obviously, we have Joint Base Lewis McChord, major training and deployment center supported by US soldiers in Vietnam, or supported US soldiers serving in Vietnam, Bangor Naval Base, and Boeing, which of course manufactured military aircraft and a lot of the equipment that was used extensively throughout that war. Here in Seattle, on the home front, there was a lot of activism going on. May I ask anybody in the audience old enough, or wise enough, I guess, to remember that era, around 1975, the Vietnam War era, seeing it on television? Anyone here active in the anti-war movement? Okay, so that was going on. Camp Murray at Fort Lewis is a historical site that temporarily housed the first Vietnamese refugees who were resettled here after the fall of Saigon in 1975. And then, of course, from that, we see the growth of the Vietnamese community, which is now 82,000 people, 82,000-ish strong statewide. At the time, also, U.S. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson was a staunch backer of military funding that had an impact on defense policy. And I think it's worth noting, too, that Boeing thrived. And when the war ended, some of you may recall, I wasn't born yet, but I have heard that it was a tough time for Boeing in the 70s. And once the war ended, it did lead to a lot of job losses and economic changes here. And then also by the 1980s, Washington State honored its Vietnam veterans with memorials like the Washington State Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Olympia. I was born and raised in Olympia, so that was like the park for us. Like anytime anybody visited, my mom and dad were like, "We're going to the wall," and every Memorial Day, my dad and the Vietnamese community would get flowers and would take it out there to honor the veterans. And of course, Vietnamese Americans continue shaping the state's cultural and political landscape. We all know Vietnamese food. We all know someone who's Vietnamese, I'm sure. I'm going to split up today's presentation into three different chapters, but we'll start with early days. And I wanted to share that recently, Mohai, after asking me to give this presentation, I asked to go take a look in the archives, and the archives out in Georgetown. And I was absolutely floored because I think I've always had this idea that our story didn't begin until April 30th, 1975, which is the day that Saigon fell to communism. I didn't realize that even before that, in the weeks before that, April 3rd, 1975, Washington State was preparing to receive orphans, and Operation Baby Lift was going on. President Gerald Ford was allowing for the children, supposedly children who did not have parents, were airlifted out of Vietnam toward the end of the war. And so these are photos from SeaTac of families who were coming to adopt children, Vietnamese children and babies. And I was really moved by this photo because those babies, there was one child who came and they took the child to the hospital and the child didn't make it and died, and there was a memorial held. And I'm very curious who these people are. And I look at that little coffin and it just makes me really sad. So by May 8th, a month later, 1975, this is Governor Dan Evans, he announced that the state of Washington would agree to participate in the resettlement and the sponsorship of at least 500 refugees from Vietnam. And this made Washington State a pioneer, and this made Governor Dan Evans really unique. At that time, as he has told this story, I've interviewed him about this, Democratic Governor Jerry Brown in California initially did not want to receive Vietnamese refugees. The first 130,000 Vietnamese who were evacuated at the end of the war were taken to Guam, to the Philippines, and then resettled, first at Camp Pendleton and then at other military bases around the country. And as the story goes, Jerry Brown did not want to receive them because there was anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiment. There was a belief that they would come and take jobs. And he apparently did not want them there. And our Republican governor said it's the right thing to do to help. And so he sent a young aide named Ralph Monroe to go check out Camp Pendleton. And Ralph went down and took these photos and brought them back. And this is Camp Pendleton. And this is, as you can see, rows and rows of tents where they housed many of the first Vietnamese refugees. You see on the bottom right, lining up, constantly lining up for food and for services. And Ralph writes that when he went down there, he was shocked to see He was shocked to see that everybody was kind of equal. The Prime Minister of Vietnam, Nguyen Cao Ky, was among the people, like everybody else. Everyone was living in a tent. Everyone was starting with nothing. And these are some scenes from the camp, which I've always just been intrigued with. Clearly, they were washing their own clothes. You had also members of the US military who were serving the refugees, and you see a lot of really big, huge, oversized jackets, so I think they were also wearing like military issue clothing. And this is, I call this the power of a 4-page memo. This was Ralph's memorandum to Governor Dan Evans reporting on what he had seen, and also recommending that Washington State could take action. He described the condition in the camps. He had conversations with the refugees to ask them about what their skills were, what they had done in Vietnam, and really brought back and was the eyes and ears to be able to tell the governor, I think there's a place for them here in Washington State. And that same day, on May 20th, 1975, this was received from the City Council. And at the time, the City Council passed a resolution, 24913, and I'll just read like a little excerpt. The City of Seattle welcomes refugees from political or religious persecution, and that if the federal government rescues Vietnamese refugees and brings them to safety in Seattle, the City of Seattle will do its part to cooperate in all ways to make each refugee welcome. And I think it speaks to our values as a city. I'm not surprised that Seattle would be generous. And there are a lot of press releases in the archive, in the Washington State Archive, where Dan Evans was really good at communicating, this is the plan. On May 22nd, he was pleased to announce that Washington citizens are welcoming the Vietnamese refugees. About 300 offers of sponsorship had already been received by that point, and the center is continuing to receive about 35 a day. Sponsorship would be local citizens, private citizens, churches, organizations. Governor Evans asked the citizens of Washington State to step up at that point and more or less serve as brothers and sisters or guides or mentors to the refugees. And how did he do that? He did that by sending a letter and posting it in the camp. And the one on the left that you see is in English. Greetings, the people of the state of Washington wish to extend to you the opportunity of making your new home with us here in Washington. And going on to tell them things like, within the state of Washington, there are at least 450 Vietnamese who have already settled here. They were primarily the wives of military veterans. With their support, your family should be able to adjust to everyday living and a new surrounding much more quickly. They warn, number 2, the climate here is very pleasant and mild. Includes good months with sunshine, several months with cooler, wet weather, and a good blend of temperatures. And then they translated that letter into Vietnamese on the right. This was the letter that was distributed at Camp Pendleton. I found this photo on top in the archive, and I imagine that maybe that's where they posted it. And that was the center, that was the hub, and these people were looking at that, and apparently about 1,000 people initially indicated interest. And the concept was, again, Washington State would receive 500. Do we have anyone in our audience today who remembers either was a refugee themselves or knows, like, was a sponsor to a Vietnamese family in 1975? Okay. But Ton, you were at another camp, right? Where was your family? You were in Arkansas? Fort Chaffee? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there were several, but Pendleton was the big one, and lots of news stories came out. And when they did come to Washington State, Fort Lewis was, some of the barracks there were kind of reconfigured, and they turned it into Camp Murray. So you see here some of the families that come, and there's a lot of food. I feel like there's a lot of photos in the archive where they ate a lot. And you see this in the memo. It's like there's always lines for food. It's like food unites us. Everybody likes food. Washington National Guard, Camp Murray. So you see they turned this sign, the Vietnamese Assistance Center. It was open here in Washington State for several months, I think through the fall of 1975. And this is a photo of the first busload of people who were brought here from the airport. And again, it doesn't exactly jive with what my idea of being a refugee is, because this man, like, he's got cool sunglasses. You know, he looks like really slick. And look, there's this like woman with an ao dai and long hair, and you know, it's like they don't look like they're struggling, you know. But his name is Bin, and he ended up actually going to Olympia, and you'll see some more photos of him moving forward. But this is one of the first refugee families stepping off of the bus in May of 1975. And some photos from that first meeting, because the governor was really good at galvanizing people to rise up, to get the media to come cover. There are news stories about these poor refugees just being attacked with cameras. And on the upper left-hand corner, like, that is the group of women who were already here. They worked through the Red Cross. They were in community, and they welcomed the people from, like, off of the buses. On the right is, again, that same family, that man that you see with his children, with his wife. And as it turns out, we are family friends. And he's also in the lower photo as well. You see, this is Governor Dan Evans, and he is, obviously the cameras are pointed at him, and he's interviewing a couple of the refugees. I would love to find this footage. I'm sure that King or Coma or somebody probably has it. But you know, they have a wonderful story, because Bin, who you see there on the upper right-hand corner, he joined DSHS, and he worked with refugees, Vietnamese refugees, for many, many years after coming here in 1975. And his son, Sung, who is second from the left, the little boy. So Sung has a son named Nathan. And in 2021, I personally got involved with some friends in helping to sponsor Afghan refugees. And Nathan came out of nowhere. And Nathan was like, I really want to help. And he was like 18 years old. And he ended up convincing his family to co-sponsor the first, privately co-sponsor the first Afghan family to come to Washington State under a pilot program. So very weird, like, you know, like full circle moment a little bit. But he had not seen these photos until he saw Mohai post this on Instagram. He's like, that's my family. and I love that, you know? And so it's like it just came from somewhere, but his father is Sung, who was one of the first sponsors of an Afghan refugee family in 2021. And I just think that's amazing. This headline cracks me up, "Welcome to America, now smile for the camera." And, you know, they talked about Bin Duong, and they talk about him here, but they don't actually quote him. Duong's wife and children were blocked by onrushing reporters, photographers, and cameramen who, triggered by the AP reporters' move, squeezed into a circle around the slight Vietnamese refugee. So it's, I mean, it was a great photo op, but you didn't hear from the refugees at that time. And I wonder why. I don't know if it was a language barrier, if it was more about the visuals, but they obviously were paraded around. And I was terrified of doing this to the refugees that we helped. It was very like, no media. You know, when they came out at SeaTac, just times have changed, you know, because we didn't really have a say. It was like, if you want help and if you want to be here, the media is going to be there and they're going to be in your face, and you just have to accept it. This is the full article from the Olympian, tiny letters, and I didn't bring my reading glasses, so I'm not going to read it here for you. But some photos from inside the camp of the refugees awaiting sponsorship at Camp Murray. And it wasn't just Vietnamese, there were also Cambodian refugees also who were at Camp Murray, and again, eating really well. And I thought this was interesting because during those first few months, the state was mobilizing, the federal government was mobilizing and trying to understand, what do we do with these 130,000 people that we evacuated? And there was a lot of debate about this. And I don't know who this Joshua Eilberg is. He's not a Washington person, but this was in Dan Evans' papers, and I thought it was interesting because imagine all these refugees come, they're sponsored out of the camps, and this person wrote about, I am distressed to hear reports that a member of the President's Advisory Committee on Refugees I won't say her name, has adopted a paternalistic approach to the Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees and has displayed an elitist attitude with regard to her work with these refugees. It is indeed disturbing that Mrs. Ender's views may be interpreted as reflecting the sentiment and disposition of the administration and other members of the advisory committee toward these refugees, and as a result, this could seriously jeopardize future resettlement efforts. This committee envisioned that the refugees would be treated not only with care and compassion, but with dignity. It was certainly not intended that the refugees become a ready supply of household servants for wealthy Americans or the unfortunate victims of misplaced humanitarianism. Refugee placement and resettlement is a serious business, and the President's Advisory Committee was not designed to provide a part-time hobby or a self-glorification vehicle for bored wives of State Department officials. If these news reports are accurate, I strongly suggest that Mrs. be immediately asked to resign from the President's Advisory Committee. And I thought this was interesting because sometimes you think maybe in the old days there was just racism and maybe they just didn't get a say in what happened, what the refugees didn't have a say in what happened to them. And I think in this case, I'm really glad that there were people looking out and who called out this kind of behavior. And in a lot of the paperwork that I've looked at as well, there's notes from a social worker here who was trying to work with a group of Vietnamese refugees of 6 Air Force pilots, former Air Force pilots, and they were trying to learn English so they could become pilots here in Washington. And in her note, she talked about some of the challenges and how moved she was by the process of just getting to know these guys and getting to understand. Some of them were able to come with their families, others were not able to come with their families and left people behind in Vietnam. And she said she would never forget the quotes from them. And this is from somebody named Tan, not me, Air Force Major for the Republic of Vietnam, saying, "You must understand, we have spent whole lives flying, always in the air, we feel like birds. Now that we cannot fly, we feel as a bird with the wings broken, and we must walk on the ground with the chickens." And I think this reflects the fact that for so many of them, coming here was a loss of identity. And to go from being an Air Force pilot, who were the mavericks, like the hot guys of South Vietnam, and to come here and to be told, like, there is nothing, you need to start somewhere, so you're gonna work on farms, you're gonna work in chicken coops and that kind of thing. This quote stuck out to the social worker. She said it made her determined to try to help them find self-sufficiency and to find a future for themselves here in Washington. And this other quote is from somebody named Giet, who's a former helicopter pilot and officer, shot down 3 times during the war. But again, when these people came here, they were not considered US veterans. They never got any they did not get the same benefits that American veterans who had fought in the Vietnam War got. But this person said, "I think it will be very beautiful to fly in this country. I have never flown with no one shooting at me." And I don't know, I would love to find out, did any of them actually become pilots? I've heard of one Vietnamese American pilot for Alaska Airlines, and I think he was within this group, but they're just those stories, you just wonder. And in the notes, she talks about there's a couple who really, really struggled with English, and there was no way they were gonna be able to resume their careers. And the next chapter I'm gonna talk about is kind of refinding our voice. Once we were resettled in community, I wanted to talk about Duc Moi because this is another pioneering move by the state of Washington, which I thought was really unique. They recognized that a part of helping refugees to resettle here was not only did you need to teach them English, but they needed information. They needed accurate information. And so Washington State was the first to fund a Vietnamese language newspaper in the country. And this newspaper ended up becoming a hub of information. People outside of Washington State would ask, they wanted this newspaper sent to them. So they would be in the Midwest or somewhere, but they heard there was this Vietnamese language newspaper funded by the state of Washington. And not only that, but people like Ralph Monroe and state officials, they recruited the refugees to basically find your own voice, write your own information in your language so that it's accurate and that people understand. But they also they said, we've got to get funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, from Washington State Humanities. And I thought about how that's so powerful. And right now we're looking at those funds are at risk or going away. And so we don't, it took advocacy by just people who had more knowledge, to be able to secure something like this. And Duc Mai existed bilingual, Vietnamese and English, from 1975 until 1987. And these are photos that I found in the archives of the editor, Vu Duc Vinh, who was a high-ranking government officer in South Vietnam, resettled here and became the first editor of the newspaper and a community leader as well. And the picture above, you can see all of the different issues, and I love the idea of there just being this like newspaper. I used to work for a newspaper. It's like a family, and this is a photo of the staff. Or I don't know who's in here, but I suspect it's the staff, it's community members. Vu Duc Vinh, the editor, is in the middle. And I think there are some celebrities in here because this is another photo, and this right here, that person is Hoàng Thị Thơ, who is one of the great songwriters, composers, entertainers, cabaret organizers of South Vietnam. And I suspect that there were Vietnamese artists who would come through Seattle and they would entertain and put on concerts for the refugees. And so they were probably having a party and having a great time, but you see faces like that. And again, they don't look like they're struggling. They look like they're happy, with their lives here. But one of the things that Vu Duc Vinh, I have a book that I brought. And this is a book that I acquired from his son. He passed away in 2005. And in 2015, his son gifted this to me. And it's a collection of his father's writing from his time as editor of Duc Mai. And there's only 3 articles in here that are in English language. And when I first read this 10 years ago, I was really moved because it opened my eyes to what was going on in the minds of these refugees who did not know whether they were going to stay or if they were going to go back to Vietnam, who very much wanted to go back to Vietnam but felt they couldn't because it was a communist country at that point. And Vu Duc Vinh wrote this in December. Hold on a second. He wrote this in December of 1976. Look at the truth to locate obstacles. During the past months, I had the chance to note some opinions expressed by the Vietnamese themselves about the relationship between each other. A Vietnamese singer and a Vietnamese songwriter who had traveled a lot throughout the United States and had contact with thousands of Vietnamese in different states said, quote, "We Vietnamese are so divided." A Vietnamese Buddhist monk who has been in this country for years and now operates a pagoda in the West expressed a similar judgment. Quote, "We Vietnamese are so separated from each other." A Vietnamese Catholic priest in Washington State during a recent conversation raised a question, quote, "How to unite the different newly established associations?" A letter written by a Vietnamese refugee who was now settled in France disclosed, "We are coming here in great numbers, but each of us is in his own world. Our relationship has loosened very much." The phenomenon of our discord is so obvious that I think it's not necessary to go over it. Certainly, this is very unfortunate. But considering the facts that brought us to this new land, we should realize that it is quite normal. We had to leave our motherland in a situation of defeat, without leadership in the last minutes. We left voluntarily. The rich and powerful people traded for their passports and got out of the country secretly. The others fought each other for a seat on a plane or a place in a ship. In order to survive, each of us had acted instinctively, and therefore, the moral value in each person had been diminished during the evacuation of 1975. Our idols have come down. We were absolutely equal on the flights and on the ships of evacuation. The ego in each of us has been revealed so clearly that each lost some respect for the other. When we arrived in this new society, once again, there were no criteria to evaluate the real values in each of us. Due to the language barrier, many had to take inappropriate jobs not equivalent to their positions in the old country. In contrast, some found in this country a better job than they had before. Thus, no one can win enough respect from the other, and no voice can have common appeal. Meanwhile, the newly established associations, which are considered a medium for gathering people, still don't have enough time and means to prove their effectiveness and to win the confidence of the people. Many associations have been established so far, but not many of us are ready to participate in them yet. Perhaps it is because we still can't forget the bad reputations of the associations in Vietnam. They had been established for the sole purpose of, quote, signing resolutions to support the administration rather than to serve the common good of their members. Although many associations have now clearly stated that they will not be used for any political purpose, it's not easy to persuade the people to trust or believe them. Besides, for many of us, the period of 1 year is not enough to solve all our important problems, such as learning English or getting some job training. Generally, we are still too busy to be able to make useful contributions. Our memories are still etched with the images of the evacuation during the summer of 1975, and our prejudices about the Vietnamese associations in Vietnam are still ingrained in our minds. Moreover, we are now facing a lot of difficulties during this beginning period in the new land. We still feel much attachment to the motherland and are still pained with the idea of having left for good. Not only do we harbor resentment against those who are responsible for our defeat, we also blame God for being unjust. Since God is so abstract, we blame those who are next to us, our compatriots who are suffering the same fate. All those factors are really the main reasons that lead to our discord and cause much difficulty in our effort at uniting. I mean, is it just me? Like, I just hadn't, to be able to understand what was going on in their minds at that time, you know? I just hadn't thought about that until I read. I didn't know. And I think it made me think of my own mom and dad, because they didn't complain, like they didn't. I knew there was a lot of pain, but they were like, there's no time. We don't have time. We don't have the luxury of slowing down. We just have to move on and we have to survive. And that's caused a lot of discord. And I think even though we're 50 years removed, I see a lot of, I'm very inspired by what we see in our Japanese American community, which it took generations, took decades to be able to look at what happened during World War II and to say that was wrong. That was an injustice to put Japanese Americans into concentration camps. It took decades for the Jewish community to be able to talk about and acknowledge the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think that, you know, we Vietnamese or Southeast Asians, we're sort of in that spot where it's like, if we want to heal and if we want to make sense of what is our shared history, especially with those who are still surviving and are still connected, you know, to what happened in 1975, now is the time. Like, we have to be looking at the past and trying to understand it and talking about it. When I was at MOHI a few weeks ago, I went through, they have a beautiful and amazing archive that I would highly encourage anyone who is Southeast Asian or has from a refugee family. They have many, many files there that are all about like documenting the Southeast Asian refugee experience, and specifically the Vietnamese experience too. And so I just took the afternoon, went out there, they brought out all of these folders, and they've digitized a lot of this as well. And I just wanted to, I'm not gonna read through each of these, but I wanted to show you all scenes of after they rebuilt what was going on. And this is Quoc Nam, who was broadcasting for Saigon Radio in Seattle, August 21st, 1996. Photos by Mike Urban from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. He founded Saigon Radio in October 1993 as the first Vietnamese language radio program in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think it exists anymore. He's a former Vietnamese military officer, immigrated to the United States in 1976. He lived in Kansas City, Seattle, and San Jose, founded newspapers in each place, and moved back to Seattle in 1993 and launched this radio station for approximately 50,000 Vietnamese Americans living in the area. So here he is in Rainier Valley, and I'm really curious, what happened to the radio station? I also love the fact that, look at all those cassette tapes and CDs, you know, at the time. So he was playing music, probably telling stories in community. And that was 1996, so that's 21 years. Imagine it takes 21 years to build up to a point where you can have a studio. And I think what the people who came here in 1975 probably, I don't think any of us realized that there would be wave after wave of Vietnamese refugees coming. This is just, you know, a quick timeline. 1975, you have the fall of Saigon. So then you have the initial evacuation of 100,000, 30,000 South Vietnamese refugees. And then between 1977, 1979, the boat people crisis, arises and we have more expanded refugee admissions. This would be where my family, if for any of you who may have heard about my podcast called Second Wave, I called it that because my family was part of the second wave of refugees who fled by boat. And then in 1980, the Refugee Act of 1980 is huge, creates the standardized refugee admission system in the US, raised the annual refugee cap, and that was a direct result of the Southeast Asian refugee crisis. And that program is gone. It's shuttered at this time. 1988, Amerasian Homecoming Act. So at that point, basically the children of veterans who had served in Vietnam, so these were children who were half white, half black, half Latino. Those children who had been left behind in Vietnam were granted special immigration status and allowed to come here to the United States. They have a tragic story. Many of them were called children of the dust in Vietnam and were looked down upon. And then when they did come here, their families took advantage of that opportunity to come with them. And there are many a horror story about that experience because they came here and they were left once again like dust by their family members. And then in the 1990s, we started to see an influx of humanitarian operation program and orderly departure. So this would be veterans who, South Vietnamese veterans who were imprisoned by the communists after the end of the war for minimum 3 years. You could then apply for special status to resettle in the United States and to bring your family under the age of, I believe it was 21. So that led to another wave. And I, as a kid, I saw all of this because I would see new Vietnamese kids coming into school all the time. And I was so consumed at the time with I don't want to be called a boater, I don't want to be fresh off the boat. And I just wanted to be this little American kid. And I'm so ashamed that at the time when you don't know and you look down on a man who's in his 50s and he comes here and he's broken because he's been imprisoned and his dignity has been taken from him for 15, 16, 17 years. Shame on me for just not knowing at the time. But then what we have in the mid-90s is the normalization of relations between the US and between Vietnam. And nowadays, it's you have students who are coming, you have family reunification, but again, all of that is currently at risk. And I will be frank and say that I wish if we knew our shared history, would we be as vocal as Japanese Americans have been against injustice that we're seeing? I'm very curious why we are not louder, why we're not saying something about what is currently happening with the refugee admission system in the US, but this is the reality. Some photos from resettlement through the years, and my dad is the one, the middle picture and the top. Immediately after arriving here in 1979, he joined with the Vietnamese American community, and they would go out to the state capitol constantly to protest, and he's holding a sign that says, "Rescue people from the South China Sea," because he had just gone through that experience. And they did this on a regular basis, I heard, for years. I don't know when they stopped. I don't know how effective it was. And then on the bottom, when I told you all that, I'm the kid in that red vest, that we would take anybody who came to visit Olympia. My parents were so proud to take them to the wall. And the thing is, another shame on me moment is I felt like we were going there to thank America and to thank American veterans for giving their lives and for serving in Vietnam. I did not know that we were too afraid to even ask, could we recognize the South Vietnamese allies who fought alongside American soldiers? Their names are not etched on the wall. They have not been allowed an official memorial. And yet, South Vietnamese veterans like my dad and a lot of our uncles, and our family members, they still show up and they still try to honor, but they can't even honor themselves, which is really sad to me. And you see a community throughout the 80s and the 90s becoming more civically engaged. That's Governor Booth Gardner on the left. I don't know if he was signing something. I don't know what the context is behind that. You see a group of Vietnamese Americans on the steps of the Capitol in Olympia. And you also see down here, this is a photo from obviously an American who is helping refugees to probably learn English. because churches and community spaces, they would hold classes for the newcomers. And this was happening throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s. And I wanted to show this photo. It's not the best quality. It's from a magazine that I scanned, but the woman on the left, her name is Fern Powers. And Fern was a bus driver and Baptist Christian woman in Olympia. She personally sponsored hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of refugees from Southeast Asia because she said Jesus told her to, and also Governor Evans. She saw an article and the governor asked people to stand up, and she was a bus driver, so she, would use her bus, and I went to visit her. She's passed away, but I went to visit her. I tracked her down in like 2015, somewhere around there, and she told us stories about how she had been warned by people in the community, you've done enough, like stop helping them. Like we don't have enough resources to help these people. They're not assimilating. They don't want to be one of us. And she said, no, these are people who need help. And I just look at people like her, and I'm less afraid of religion when I hear about, or when I think about people. And everybody in the Vietnamese community in Olympia, they called her Ba Fern, which is Mrs. Fern. They all knew her and they all loved her. And this is a photo. She turned her home into a community center for all of the recent refugees, especially the unaccompanied minors. Thousands and thousands of people came to the US as children, and she would have clothing and food, and her husband, her children were all in on helping the community in Olympia. And these are photos from her collection that she shared with me before she passed away. I don't know any of the names, but obviously these are groups of unaccompanied and refugee youth who it looks like they took them on outings. It looks like someone here graduated, I think that's Capitol High School in Olympia, like my high school, my alma mater where I went. And they look like they're having a great time. But there's also some serious trauma. And throughout this entire time, mind you, I think we didn't talk about trauma in the 80s and 90s. You just didn't. And so I look at these now and I wonder, how much were you masking? Were you masking? Were you hiding your pain and what you were feeling? And, bless the people who gave these young people an opportunity to go out and to see community and see the world. This is a picture of Hoi and Nguyen Jung, family at their sponsor's home in Kirkland in June 26, 1975. Hoi Tran had been a major in the South Vietnamese Air Force. What I love is that mom is knitting, and nothing's gonna stop her. I hope that brought her a lot of joy. Who's this family? I would love, do they know that their photo, that this was in the Seattle PI's archive that's now at MOHI? Amerasian children arriving at SeaTac Airport, February 1st, 1983. Ann Tran holding baby during reunion at SeaTac Airport, February 23rd, 1993. And in the caption, look at this woman. In 1954, Ann Tran sent 6 of her children from their home in North Vietnam to South Vietnam to escape the impending rule of the North Vietnamese Communist government. Ann and her husband followed their children, but were captured at the border and sent to separate jails. The husband escaped to South Vietnam, but Ann was returned to the North, where she lived with her eldest daughter and gave birth to her youngest child, unaware of the fate of her husband. The Nguyen family was eventually able to notify Ann that they had arrived safely in Saigon, but they feared imprisonment or death if they attempted to return north for her. After Saigon fell in 1975, a daughter who worked for the US government was able to get the Nguyen family on a plane to the US. Thao Nguyen, the husband, tried unsuccessfully to bring his wife to the US by official channels, and Ann herself made 3 unsuccessful attempts to flee by boat. After hearing of Thao's death in 1987, Ann gave up her plan to emigrate, instead staying in Vietnam with her 2 children. The family, however, persevered, and Ann received permission to emigrate in 1993. On February 23rd, 1993, Ann Tran was greeted at SeaTac Airport by a large group of family and friends, including the 6 children she hadn't seen in 39 years, and their families. In this photo, Ann Tran meets one of the youngest members of her family during the reunion at the airport. And this photo was taken by Paul Brown, or Paul Joseph Brown for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. 39 years to reunite a family. Can you imagine? And that was the story for so many people. who came in 1975 or boat people who came throughout the 80s, it took many, many, many years for them to reunite with their loved ones. A little girl, Bao Zhao, with South Vietnamese flag at Hinh Hae Park, Seattle, May 1st, 1982. And that flag she's holding is very significant for South Vietnamese. I think Americans will know it as that usually signifies the Vietnam War in an American context. And for the South Vietnamese, that was the flag that they recognized, was the yellow flag with the 3 red stripes. They do not like to recognize the current flag of Vietnam today, which has become it's a polarizing issue within our community still. In this photo, Dai Vu and his brother looking at a family photo in Seattle on October 14th, 1979. He arrived as a 10-year-old in the US with his father and 2 older siblings after living in a Malaysian refugee camp for 5 months. All of the family's money went into the boat passage for the 4, and Dai's mother and younger siblings had to be left behind in Seattle. Dai attended school at Lake City Elementary, where he struggled to understand his lessons and to communicate with his classmates. His uncle, who fled Vietnam after the fall of Saigon in 1975, was the Vietnamese English teacher at the school. Dai studied basic English and the culture of the US with other Vietnamese students in his uncle's classroom each day. Here, Dai Vu and his brother look at a photograph of their family that had been taken when they lived together in Vietnam. And they just look so wistful. And this photo was by Dale Blindheim. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. Bin Nguyen with the training diploma, Seattle, December 17, 1982. Looks like in 1982, the Asian Counseling and Referral Service in Seattle ran a 15-week vocational and language course to help Southeast Asian refugees in the Seattle area become more independent. Students took English in the morning, classes in vocational skills each afternoon to prepare them for employment as janitors or custodians. Here, Bin displays the diploma he received upon completion of the class. He owned a fabric shop in Vietnam before leaving in 1979 and now had a job as a janitor for Seattle City Light. Photo by Jennifer Werner. Tok Vu with students at Evergreen High School in White Center, May 5th, 1989. He taught Cambodian and Vietnamese students primarily at the school. This photo is also by Jennifer Werner Jones. Thuy and Xuan Vu and family at home in Olympia, September 1985. They're family friends, and I went to high school with Lian, the little boy on the right. He was a year older than me, and his sister, my Ann, is the person on the left. And Thuy is a PhD, so he's retired now, and he teaches economics, but for a time, they were sort of known as like the educated family in Olympia, so everybody kind of looked up to them. He also ran the refugee office for a while as well, so it was fun to see familiar faces in the archive. 4 people eating at a restaurant in Little Saigon, Seattle. Didn't identify what the restaurant was. I'm very curious. I don't know, is this Hung Bin, like 1993? Is it Pho Bac? Who are these people? The bông riu they're eating looks really good. Teresa Vu preparing bowls of pho at Pho Bac restaurant in Seattle, January 14th, 1993, the matriarch of the family that still owns Pho Bac today. Tieng Dak Nguyen mopping the floor in Seattle, February 18, 1976. So the caption here said that by early 76, there were more than 4,000 Vietnamese refugees in Washington state. Most had held positions of some status in Vietnam and earned decent incomes. They were now competing with Americans for scarce jobs, and their options were complicated by the lack of a cohesive public program for Asian immigrants, with political struggle among local community groups, private refugee agencies, the state government, and the federal government over the kinds of services which should be provided and how they would be financed and staffed. Many ended up in menial jobs with little time or resources to take classes which would improve their prospects. So here, Tieng Dak Nguyen, 27 years old, a former lieutenant in the Vietnamese Navy, mops floors in the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Building in Seattle. He had no family here and was saving money to go to school so he could get a better job. Photo by Howard Staples. What's next? I mean, that's just a sample of some photos. We have a slideshow that I could show you, but I don't know how we're doing. It's 7:30, and I want to make sure that we have time to discuss. So I'm going to talk about what's next for me is more exploration. These are places, but I also encourage you and the people that you know to do this exploration while you can and while we still have some connection to the people who have this memory and can provide details such as where was your family from in Vietnam? How did they come? Do you know what year they came? Those little details can really help. And from then, it's research at the Washington State Archives, University of Washington collections, Wing Luke Museum. Obviously, my next step is I'd really like to take a look at the papers of Washington State elected officials, past and present. Scoop Jackson, my dad and his sponsor, tried valiantly to look for their family friends who were missing at sea. And I want to find that letter. What was that letter like? And my dad didn't know how to write it on his own. And so his American sponsor, Roger Stenberg, wrote the letter and sent it. And I'd love to find it because that mystery still haunts that family in Vietnam today. To this day, they were never able to find 3 children in their family that they put on a boat. And what would it be like to just try to trace that a little bit and I want them to know that they weren't forgotten. Like, my family got very lucky and everyone survived the boat ride, but there were so many people who are going to be forgotten and lost to history. And obviously Mohi here, it's an incredible collection. I think there's a lot more to explore. And again, not just the Vietnamese experience, but also Cambodian, the Lao community, the Filipino community, and the Thai community and beyond. And I'm really interested in exploring community archival efforts and storytelling. And I hope during our presentation or during our Q&A, I would love ideas from you. Like, is there an appetite for us to be able to hold space, to be able to do this? Why is it important? How I love to solve problems. And so it's like, how can I help to facilitate that using my skills and my passion as a storyteller? So if you want to collaborate or support my independent work, contact me. My email's tt@tontan.co, or come talk to me afterward. And some questions that I wanted to open up to think about, because I would love your thoughts on the Vietnam War and you. I'll put this out there. What historical contexts and challenges have you and or your family faced after the Vietnam War? You don't have to be Vietnamese. You could be part of related to or adjacent to a family that had sent an American son or friend, whatever, to Vietnam to fight in the war. When we think about the global refugee crisis today, examining the current situation, including conflicts in regions like Syria, Afghanistan, and Central America that have led to mass displacement of people, what do you think we still need to, what can we learn? What do we need to know about those experiences happening right now? Shared experiences, lessons learned when we're reflecting on the Vietnamese American experience here in Washington and seeing the massive amount of community work that it took to help resettle Vietnamese here. And also call to action. How can you actively support and advocate for the rights and the well-being of refugees, both in your local community and on a global scale? Those are all questions that I hope my presentation maybe helped you think about. If I could get some help with getting that slideshow up, and we can talk about the slideshow, but I would love to open up the floor. Any thoughts, questions, insights, people you recognize? Yeah, go ahead. Not all at once. Hi, Ton. Hold on, we're going to bring a microphone to you.
Hey, Tan, can you talk about the documentary that you're working on?
Yeah, I am working on a documentary about the last person, the last South Vietnamese veteran rescued from the last battle, major battle of the Vietnam War. And his name is Che Nguyen, and he is 86 years old, 2-time Bronze Star recipient, one of the most decorated soldiers in South Vietnamese history. And he's in Detroit, Michigan today, but he's had a really extraordinary life that tracks with the Cold War. And I got to know him, become really close to him after 10 years of reporting on, documenting, and taking portraits of his unit. They are the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's 18th Division. Their stories are going to be lost because they were on the losing side, and many of them suffered greatly and were imprisoned after the war. And their history has been actively erased in Vietnam and forgotten, or people don't care here in the US because they lost. And there's a lot of bitterness about it, but I don't want those stories to be forgotten. And so I'm currently working on an independent documentary feature-length film project about Che. And I've done the interviews, I've gone out there to visit him, and I'm looking to finish it. So if anyone here feels a connection to that story or to the veterans of South Vietnam, please come find me. Thank you for asking. I'll probably try to get something out by April 30th this year, which is the 50th anniversary, but there's gonna be a lot more work to be done on that project. Thank you.
So I'm really curious. One thing I love to ask people is, I'm interested in the arts, and when people see themselves in art that they're taking in as a child or growing up. And I'm wondering if you had any experiences with, representation of Vietnamese Americans that that really stuck with you or meant a lot to you, or conversely was harmful in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I was born in 1981, 43 years old, child of the 80s. I just didn't, there are so many ways to answer this question. I didn't see our stories represented on screen in a meaningful way. What I did see, and I shouldn't have seen as a kid, was, cousins and my father and people so desperate for Vietnamese content that they were watching Oliver Stone movies. They were watching Platoon. They were watching Heaven and Earth. And these movies, and I was a kid, right? And you'd kind of get nightmares. You're like, what is this? And you think of Vietnam as being helicopter rice paddies and weapons and women who are not human and are girlfriends or, getting raped. And I don't think that was good, and I think it probably, I couldn't name it for a really, really long time, which is it was internalized. I don't want to say, it's not colonization because I didn't live under colonization. It's not that, or internalized racism in a way, where I just kind of accepted, and I think also felt until very recently that I don't really have the agency to change that depiction, we are in the minority. And also I was raised in a family and in a community that very much bought into be quiet, work hard, merit works, and we just need to survive. So I see some heads nodding because I don't think I'm the only one who felt that way. I think that's a very universal issue, which is why, again, I'll emphasize that seeing how other communities have processed their shared history and shared traumas. Say it again, the Jewish community, and seeing how Japanese Americans have organized and kept that history alive through archival, through oral history. It's so important, and we do have to model that so that people know that it's okay, because I think far too many people are living in isolation. I can't tell you how many Vietnamese Americans of all ages I've interviewed in my career who are like, I don't really have a story to tell, but they do. And they don't want to tell it because of the shame, because they think they're the only ones who have endured it. And I think that's really too bad. So, but it's a process. I wouldn't say, I kind of flipped a switch at some point and then started talking a lot, got really personal as an editorial writer, as a podcast host and reporter, as an opinion writer. I really the pendulum swung, and I'm like, I'm gonna say what I wanna say. And it was hard for my community to accept that, and my own family members to accept it, because we've gotten very comfortable in being the good refugees. And no one wants to question or deal with shame and the fact that sometimes terrible things happened as a result of not processing our trauma. And we pass that down to the next generation. I don't want to pass that down. I'm trying to be a cycle breaker. And so I think seeing what other communities have done and seeing other Vietnamese writers and Vietnamese artists just practice their craft and tell the stories that they want to tell, I have to actively remind myself that I do not have to give in to scarcity mentality, which is that there's only room at the top for one or two perspectives. We all have stories that we can share, so I hope that helps. Thank you for the question. Can you get the microphone so that the audience online can hear you?
I'm curious about your education in the United States, what your interests were, academic interests, because I'm thinking you studied ethnic studies or something like that.
I did, well,
your
no,
thinking.
I went to USC in LA. I studied international relations and broadcast journalism. And my husband's here. I've threatened to maybe I should go for a master's or a PhD. And he's like, no. Yeah, I don't have formal training as in ethnic studies or in history. I don't. I'm just.
So just further with international relations at USC, what facet of international relations were you attracted to?
Well, I think that, at the time I was at USC, they kind of really encouraged us. I just wanted to study journalism and get out and go work and go report. That's really all I wanted to do. But I think it was there was encouragement to breadth with depth and to try to pick up another degree if possible and something that was going to help with critical thinking skills. Journalism is very much a craft. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD from Columbia. It doesn't make you a great journalist. And so the international relations was to really understand critical thinking and analysis and understanding foreign relations. I loved the concept of the UN and what the UN does. I loved the Olympic movement. It was things like that. And obviously, coming from a family that endured the Vietnam War, but that was not the reason. The Vietnam War was not the reason that I wanted to study international relations.
You wanted to understand the world.
Yeah, I really just wanted to tell stories. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just really curious. It's very accessible. Okay, I'm just really curious why you thought that she was majoring in ethnic studies.
Because I'm a former academic person. I was in Vietnam before the war, and I came back to finish school in California when the riots were being held all around me. And that's when ethnic studies began, and that's when women's studies began, and the Indian awareness, and lots of awarenesses. And I know that what we study forms our thinking. And when you say critical thinking was something I heard in academic circles. Suddenly we were taught to think critically. I'm from Hawaii, so I didn't grow up being critical. In Hawaii, you just kind of float, I grew up in a beach town, so in a sense, I came from I'm going to exaggerate, and I'm not insulting myself or Hawaii, but growing up in Hawaii when I did, we just enjoyed being and, just little hometown. So with my evolution from being born in Hawaii, and then my life path, and I notice, I'm trying to answer your question, I noticed how my mind evolved. East-West Center began at the University of Hawaii, and then suddenly on campus there were scholars coming from Asia and America. So that's why I ask.
Could we maybe get a chance for other people to ask some questions? There's somebody who is.
Well, I can share with you that, I am first generation or first wave Vietnamese that came to the United States. My parents came to the United States in '75. And there were and we were sponsored by a church in Victoria, Texas, in '75. Actually, my family did come to Seattle in 1976. And Hoi and Nguyen Jung were my aunt and uncle. And in fact, Vu, Dit Vung Vin, I think that's his name, that's also my uncle, part of my family. You mentioned about shame, and I think that a lot of it, at least I don't feel shameful. I am a Vietnamese refugee. I'm very grateful for America to accept us. And I feel, and I don't identify myself, by the way, as Vietnamese American. I'm an American of Vietnamese descent because this is my country. I actually went to Cornell to get a PhD in sociology to understand my experience adapting to the United States. So I think that there is a need to talk about this, and there are many academicians who have, touch on this. But I don't know if it's shame that stop us from talking. I think a lot of it is pain, having to relive that painful day. Like, for example, my family escaped from Vietnam on the last day, April the 30th, leaving the last boat or ship from Vietnam, flying the last Vietnamese flag. And the communists were, I guess, shooting cannon at us. And our ship was sunk in the China Sea for 3 days. We sent SOS to many ships and were not being rescued until a Danish ship rescued us and took us to Hong Kong, where they opened the first Vietnamese refugee camp. So shame, I'm not sure. That's not my experience. I'm very proud of what the Vietnamese have accomplished in this country. I am first generation in this country, and I have a doctorate from an Ivy League institution. I know that Julie Pham, for example, from Oxford. There are so many Vietnamese, so I don't know if it's shameful, but I think that it is very painful, especially for my parents' generation, to talk about that experience and the racism that we experienced when we came to this country. For me, especially, because I live in Texas. So that's the reason why I asked you about, I think that everyone, whether you're in communication or whether you're a scientist or whatever, I think that there's going to be that moment in time that we're going to ask that question. For me, because I'm first generation, it's very poignant. But for the second generation, right, Vietnamese who were born in America, they're going to have that question, right, about their family, about their history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I recognize my privilege, having not been first generation. I was not on the boat. I did not go through what my parents went through. And I think that distance and that time, I recognize my privilege as well. But we all, I think, and it's a very personal journey for everybody. It really is. I'm not here to speak for all Vietnamese. We are not a monolith. So for some, it's too painful. For others, it's too much shame that we don't have the tools to process. Everyone has a different reason for why they do or do not want to talk about the past and process their trauma. But thank you.
We got a question from the live stream.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations for books, either about Vietnamese American or Vietnamese history that maybe influence you?
There are so many books. I will say I have like a ton of academic books that are just too dense and too much information for me to kind of, like, someday I will read this. No, I tend to, the stories that I process, Viet Thanh Nguyen, obviously the sympathizer was a big one that I think opened up my eyes, but he would be the first to say he's not the only one. He wasn't the first, he's not the last. So there are so many Vietnamese writers. Nguyen Phan Quay Mai and Kevin Nguyen is another author. Like people who are writing both fiction and nonfiction, and there's a robust academic world as well of people who have studied Vietnamese American studies and what, in our experiences. So I think this is a let me Google it for you situation, and a lot of books and reading will come up for you. But I think personally where my head is at right now is looking at these photographs and ephemera. I collect ephemera from, I have a dealer in Vietnam, like pre-1975, trying to understand what were they reading, what was informing them. I have a massive collection of pre-1975 Vietnamese records because I believe music and song and the lyrics contain a lot of the stories that are sometimes too painful for our community to talk about. And so I'm trying to find other avenues other than directly sometimes asking somebody to relive something terrible that they don't want to talk about. But I find that the music, it's a very universal language, and so I learn a lot from listening to the music, from looking at the lyrics, from Googling the lyrics, translating the lyrics, and having conversations sometimes with my parents, not about, hey, tell me about that thing that happened to you, but what does this song mean for you? Or what music did you listen to when you were in the military, Dad? What did you listen to when you were a young man? So those are the kinds of stories. I wouldn't say, I have a ton of books, but I'm not reading them. I'll just be totally honest about that. How about someone who hasn't asked a question yet, and then I'll come back to you. In the in the front.
I just want to start off by saying thank you for doing this. And second question is, were you always close with your family in regards to talking about deep stuff like this?
No.
No. So I'm second generation, and the older I get, I just want to get in touch with that side and learn about that past with my mom. Would you have any recommendations of how would you start with that?
Yeah.
Especially with that language barrier of I know more English than I do Vietnamese, and vice versa. My mom knows more Vietnamese than English.
Yeah.
So it's a little hard there.
No, I think sometimes, you know what it is? There's things that you can do on your own that your parents don't have to be involved with, I learned how to speak Vietnamese, and not from reading and going to Vietnamese school, but by watching Hong Kong dramas that were dubbed badly into Vietnamese. But I was so obsessed with the story that I learned my Vietnamese from that. And so that's what I've done on my own. Whatever I have to do to try to understand it and learn it. And nowadays you have tools like Duolingo. There's so many. So there's the things that you can do on your own. But I think that there are the things that you can do with your family through experience and just being able to make eye contact with each other, because there's a lot that happens that's unspoken as well. So maybe if, find out, I don't know what your family likes to do. My mom loves to cook. And so that was something that, teach me how to cook. And she's like, every woman has to have a signature dish, and so she has no issues with teaching me how to cook a recipe, right? And then just little tidbits come out of that. And, things like I collect this music and sheet music, and I took the sheet music down to show my dad because it was something that he could explain to me because he understands it so much better, right? And so, it was interesting because in just looking at the sheet music, my dad, who was I have no stories to tell, whatever. And then in looking at the sheet music, he told me about when he was 16 or 17 years old, he went to try out for the national school, the conservatory in South Vietnam, and he was accepted. And he could have chosen the path of becoming a guitarist. and hanging out with all the singers and stuff, but he decided to go to college and continue and pursue, and ended up becoming a teacher, and then also a civil servant, and also was in the military as well. So it's like, and it was weird, just kind of like, you play guitar? Like, I had no idea, because once he came here, he shed that identity. It's like, I don't have time to feel joy. I have things I've got to do for my community, for my family. And so just those little tidbits will just tell you so much about your parents. And so, and if I can help you, I'm happy to recommend some songs, that you can ask your parents, hey, will you explain what this is to me? And this is where translation tools are your friend. And it really, I've seen this happen in listening parties. I've seen how it draws people together. It's really, it's fascinating. So some little tidbits for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Hi. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for all those tips that you just shared and techniques for how to open up those conversations with your relatives. I'm wondering, for those of us who are not trained journalists, do you have any recommendations of tools and tips for us when it comes to, recording those or documenting those stories with our relatives?
Oh, yeah. I've recorded many conversations without my dad knowing, and I mean, because sometimes the moment you tell them, let me tell you, the moment you tell them, it's like, can I sit you down and interview you? They're like, nope, I have nothing to say. And they're really, really self-conscious. My dad's the type of person, he'll write like his responses. And so I've just, again, it's the whole, I go down to Olympia, can we have lunch? And we sit there and we talk, and these things kind of come out, or we watch Paris by Night together, like it's the act of doing things and then asking them to explain to you. And I don't know about you, I understand Vietnamese, trust me, way better than I can speak it. And I can't really read and write. I'm like first grade level, barely, so you can do it. Like, if I can do it, you can do it. I promise you. So it's finding those things, those experiences that you can enjoy together. And then if you have your iPhone, it's so easy, record, and you're not going out there. My family has, like, they've gotten in the habit of, like, this is not for you to write about, and so you don't have to worry about that. You're not, this is just for your own personal archive. So always having that phone there, press the voice memo when you're having these conversations, when something's coming out, it's okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question from our live stream first, somebody watching. They are interested to know if you're taking any help with making a documentary. They're a filmmaker who's interested in working with you.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Yeah, contact me. I'm rebuilding my team right now. I need a lot of help. It depends on what they want to do. But yes, please get in touch with me. I'm looking for producers. I'm looking for people who are interested in engagement. I'm looking for archival support, all of that. So.
And what might be the best avenue for contacting?
Email me or go to my website, tontan.co. There's a contact form there. But I did put my, I don't want to put this on the internet. Is somebody going to let's see here.
Well, I think if it's your website, that
go to my
work,
website
yeah.
and contact me there. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
And my name is spelled THANHTAN.CO. No M.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. There's a person in the yellow jacket.
Yeah, thank you for all of this. It's great. I came here, in 1975, I was in Olympia, and I did work with Vietnamese refugees over the summer. And I guess I was just sort of hoping that maybe somebody might be here. I of course lost contact so many years ago, but I guess I don't know.
We have a grandson of someone who came in 75. We're here. So.
Oh, yeah?
From Olympia.
Oh, really? Nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I was hoping that maybe I might be able to see anybody that might have been there at that time in Olympia in 1975. But
oh, there's a whole community. There is a whole community of people, and they love to get together. There's a group. I had the chance to go to this Maxi Min, he's a doctor here, and he had this meeting of all these Vietnamese people who came in '75, and my dad was invited, so he brought me, and it was so great. They had this huge speaker system with like karaoke, like on the side of his office, you know, and they were just talking about how proud they were of their kids, and you know, it was great. But they had that bond of having been among the first who were here. So, and in Olympia, it's the same thing, yeah. But
Yeah, I wonder how many people stayed on in Olympia.
quite a few. We had I mean, I was born and raised. I didn't leave
Right.
Olympia until I was 18 years old. So it was a formative experience. And I was very much like feet in two worlds, for sure. You know, Vietnamese at home, Vietnamese school on Fridays, local events with community. But at school, I, you know, was very much entrenched in a different world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but thank you for reaching out to help too. I know that you're not the only one. I know there's at least one other person here. I'm staring straight at her. Look at me. Who has also stepped up to help refugees. So to all of you in the room who have done that at some point in your life, thank you. I don't know how we're doing on time. Are we? I'm happy to finish answering
It's
any
a little
questions.
over 8.
Okay.
We can do a couple more.
Okay. Any other insights or questions?
I wanted to say, I attended a lecture at UW, and this Vietnamese Viet Q had just received tenure and had published a book about the trauma. The thesis was the trauma that Vietnamese Americans felt.
Mm-hmm.
Her generation is just, I think your generation, was that their parents never talked about what happened. So that was her main theme, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that was last year, the book was published.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying, I think, is accurate. When you read, you talk about trauma, that's
Yeah.
what the word, that was her words.
Yeah.
That was her word. And so what you talk about interviewing your family,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's something that is very current now, the importance of listening to family members and showing interest. Otherwise, the stories are lost.
Yeah. Well, this is why it was my history. It was the humanities classes I took that would give those assignments. Talk to your parents. Talk to somebody in your family. So that kind of, you know, like I was interested. I knew I was aware of my family's history. But I have to say that the moment that really hit me was, and this could be a resource for some of you, may not be. I would look up the case Lay versus Tan, or Tan versus Lay. Which is a famous defamation case that was decided here in Washington State. Tan is my father. My father was falsely accused of being a communist Viet Cong agent in Olympia. And I was a journalist in 2009 and got subpoenaed to come back to Washington and testify. And I had no idea that this had been going on. I knew that the politics in our community was really scary, but I didn't know the extent of it. And I would say that the 2 weeks in that courtroom of watching people on both sides, all Vietnamese, be cross-examined, talking about the roots of why they believe what they believe, the trauma they had been through, it was so heartbreaking for me because it was seeing firsthand. There was the war that ended on the battlefield, but now because they have had no means of being able to process this in a healthy way, I don't think PTSD is uttered in in much of our community. So they were projecting that pain in really unhealthy ways. And when I was in that courtroom for 2 weeks, like watching this unfold, it was eye-opening for me. I think that was my friends, I was in Idaho at the time, and my friends were like, it was kind of like, you know, when Beyonce, people were like, Beyonce's black? Like there was a moment where she just kind of crossed over, I'm gonna own my blackness. And for me, it was that moment that I was like, I'm gonna embrace my Vietnamese heritage because I didn't know. And maybe if I had known, it would have stopped my father from going through this incredibly painful ordeal. You know, and so that case though covers a lot, not just defamation law, but it also covers quite a bit about Vietnam War and the impact that it had on the refugees who came here to the US. And so I would just recommend that. It's a well-known case study. Tan versus Lay.
Hi there. I'm in the back.
Hi.
Hi. First off, I just want to say thank you so much for all of this and all of the work that you do. I know that you were one of the first Vietnamese Americans to serve in an on-air capacity for a commercial television station in the United States, and I know you don't talk about that all that often, but
I forgot.
that inspired me 20 years ago to follow in your footsteps, and I just want to say thank you for that. Secondly, I'm curious because you eventually, you worked in commercial television and then you switched to public television.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? And then also, was there an aha moment, I guess, when you decided like this is the work like I want to dive into, or was it just kind of like just upon reflection of just your family's collective history? Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, the first question is public media rules. When I was in college, I was like, I want to go to 60 Minutes, and that's it, And I did an internship at NPR. I had interned at Nightline, and somebody that I had interned there, he was at NPR West, and that changed my life. Just 3 months of being in the NPR office, and I understood this is public media. It wasn't sensational. It was very calm, and I felt like, gosh, this is meditative. And so it was. But then I was like a newbie. I had just graduated, and it was at some point it became, I wasn't going to get a job in public media. It was sell pantyhose at Nordstrom for $12 an hour in LA, or move to Boise, Idaho, and become a television news reporter up there. And so eventually I didn't have that choice when you're just starting off. So I went into commercial, local television news as a general assignment reporter. But I loved listening to public radio, just the tone, the type of storytelling. And I just always believed that maybe that's where I belong. And so I was a local TV news reporter for 5 years for the CBS station in Boise. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I was with the ABC affiliate there and hated my life every day. I was being sent up into helicopters, to cover a crime scene that had, ended, something that had happened hours ahead of time. And I remember covering a dam, they had a dam explosion, and the anchor was like, Dawn, what was the view like? What did you see up there? And I was like, what you just saw? And so it was really ridiculous. And it was just this race to state the obvious. And I just couldn't handle it. And so I quit my job. I was supposed to do a 3-year contract. A year and a half into it, I'm taking a pay cut. I'm going back to Idaho. I'm working for Idaho Public Television. That's all there is to it. So it was just a period in my life, quarter-life crisis, 25 years old, and made that decision. And so I've always had a special place in my heart for public media, and Idaho Public Television and PBS was also where I learned to moderate debates, to produce shows, to produce documentaries long-form treatments, and it was just a different purpose. It was public interest. It's they say that, in exchange for the use of the public airways, you're supposed to provide a service, and I did not feel like I was doing that when I worked in local TV news, and I didn't like who I was, in that space, and so I made a change, and I took a risk, but I have no regrets about it, and I'm really sad to see that public media is getting attacked today. It's terrible. But maybe we have to lose something before we understand its value. It feels like that's happening with a lot of things. And then the second question that you asked me, I think it was sitting in that courtroom in Olympia, Washington, in Thurston County in 2009. At economy had tanked at that point, and here I was. Watching my dad probably at the lowest point in his life, being attacked and being accused of being the enemy. Nobody wants to see that happen to someone that they love. And I am a spitting image of my dad in a lot of ways. I'm totally his daughter. And so I think that was the need to try to fill in these blanks It's like, I have to explore these Vietnamese stories because I'm watching how not processing it is doing damage to my family and to also other families and to our community in some ways, you know? So, but I don't take it lightly. It's been an up and down. Like I just know my limits. The last few years, I talk about my family less. I don't really show pictures of them, you know, anymore. And so the music, the archival work, the things that are already public and out there, I see a lot of value in this because I need to leave my family alone and let them heal and process in their own way. Does that make sense? So I would say, yeah, the courtroom in 2009 was probably that was the turning point. And my friends in Idaho were like, because I was mountain bike, I did a lot of white people stuff, you know, and my friends, like, people were like, you're like really Vietnamese. I'm like, yeah, I am, you know. So it's been a bit of a journey. Okay, I think we're past 8 o'clock. If there are no more questions, I'm happy to stick around. Thank you.